Manhattan, the Harrington Tower, 53 floors above the city's chaos. Roman Kingsley stood alone at the edge of the penthouse, his eyes scanning the glittering skyline that stretched endlessly before him. The city hummed with life beneath the towering glass and steel. But here, 53 stories above it all, Roman felt nothing but the cold emptiness of his own mind. It was a familiar feeling, one he'd lived with for years. At 34, Roman had everything. A sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a fleet of private jets, a portfolio of businesses that spanned continents, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the world. He'd built an empire with his own hands, and now his name was as synonymous with tech as Silicon Valley itself. He had money, power, influence, everything a man could ever want. But none of it mattered. He looked down at the city, the streets winding like veins of a living organism. He'd conquered it all. But what was the point? At the gala tonight, amidst the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the polite smiles of the world's elite, Roman felt as though he was suffocating in the weight of it all. All the luxury, all the wealth, all the people vying for his attention. It was nothing but a gilded cage. It was a scene he knew too well. The Harrington Foundation Gala, the social event of the season, was just another performance. The same faces, the same conversations, the same fake philanthropy disguised as charity. A stage where everyone wore their best masks, and Roman was no different. He could feel their eyes on him, their subtle positioning, their attempts to gain favor. It was exhausting. Every conversation was a transaction, every handshake a calculated move. Everyone wanted something, a deal, an endorsement, a seat at the table. The only thing they didn't want from him was the man behind the empire. Roman took a long sip from his crystal flute, the champagne's effervescence tickling his throat. But it left him hollow. Is this it? He wondered, staring down at the glass, watching the bubbles pop, just like his life. The bubbles of excitement that had long since fizzled out. He had everything, but nothing that truly meant anything. That was when his gaze shifted across the room. Her. Violet Stone. A woman in the crowd, standing apart from the socialites and billionaires who were dancing around him like moths to a flame. She wasn't like the others. Her presence wasn't fabricated. She wasn't busy trying to impress anyone. She was simply there, exuding an effortless elegance that made Roman pause. Her dark hair framed her face in soft waves, her profile sharp and beautiful, yet there was something hauntingly distant about her. She stood alone, speaking with a small group of people. But her eyes, those eyes, never left the conversation. She wasn't scanning the room for approval. She wasn't pretending to be interested in the superficial world around her. She was simply present, absorbed in her own world. Roman's mind whirred. Who was she? He moved toward her, feeling that familiar pull. The magnetic force of his status, his power. He was used to the world parting for him, to people leaning in, desperate to get close. But Violet wasn't one of them. When he made his approach, she didn't turn her head toward him, didn't flash him that practiced smile of recognition. She didn't even acknowledge him at first. A flicker of curiosity rippled through him. She didn't know who he was. He stepped closer, his voice calm, his smile effortless. But inside, there was a gnawing sense of something unfamiliar. He had his wealth. He had the power to bend the world to his will. What could a woman like this want from him? Hello, he said, standing just close enough for her to notice. Roman Kingsley. He extended his hand, his gaze never leaving hers. Violet looked up, Her eyes were dark, unreadable. For a brief moment, Roman swore he saw something. Something like indifference, a lack of interest, a coolness he wasn't used to. It unsettled him. And then she spoke. "No," she said simply, her voice quiet but firm, a single word that rang through his mind. "No." Roman's hand froze midair, inches away from hers. The world seemed to pause, the hum of the gala falling into a distant murmur. Her rejection wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was almost serene in its finality. A simple word. But it was a word he had never heard. For a moment, he stood there, speechless. No one said no to Roman Kingsley. Not the investors, not the beautiful women who followed him like shadows. No one. But she had. She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned back to her conversation, completely dismissing him, as though he were just another fleeting figure in her peripheral vision. Roman couldn't move. He couldn't even think. His mind spun, but it felt as though the universe had frozen. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own vulnerability. That no lingered in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that gnawed at him. Why? He asked himself. What was it about her that made him feel this way? Roman had everything. Everything. But in that moment, he realized something that both terrified and thrilled him. He wanted her. Not because of her beauty, or because of who she was in the room. No. He wanted her because she had rejected him. And for the first time in his life, he found himself consumed by something he couldn't buy, couldn't control. Roman Kingsley, the man who had always gotten everything he wanted, couldn't get her. And he couldn't stop thinking about it. Roman watched her retreat into the crowd, her back turned to him, and something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, Roman felt something stir within him, something raw and unguarded. Desire, curiosity, obsession. He turned away from the crowd, making his way to the balcony, his mind racing. The champagne in his hand suddenly tasted flat. The world below no longer felt as enticing. His thoughts were consumed by one thing. Violet Stone. The woman who had said no when everyone else had said yes. And that's when he knew. He had to have her. The rest of the night passed in a blur of empty smiles and pointless conversations. But Roman Kingsley was no longer paying attention. He wasn't focused on the guests, the deals, the endless games of status and influence. He was only thinking about the one woman who had made him feel, truly feel, in a way that his wealth, his empire, never had. She had said no, and that was all he could think about. Roman Kingsley spent the rest of the gala in a daze, the crowd swirling around him in a blur of champagne flutes and polite applause. The weight of Violet's rejection lingered in the pit of his stomach, like a constant, gnawing presence. The way she had looked at him, as if he were just another face in the crowd. It wasn't a harsh rejection, but a quiet, composed one. And somehow, that made it all the more unsettling. He found himself excusing himself from conversations, his mind constantly drifting back to Violet Stone. He couldn't explain it. In a life where he had everything, power, influence, wealth, this one woman had become an obsession. Who was she? Violet Stone. The woman who had said no when every other woman in the room would have said yes. Roman had never been rejected. He wasn't used to feeling insignificant, let alone insignificant to someone who wasn't chasing his wealth. But Violet, she was different. The next morning, Roman's usual routine was disrupted by his thoughts of her. His assistant, Margaret, came into his office at exactly 9 a.m., as she always did. But he barely noticed her. He barely noticed anything. He was consumed with one thing only: her. "Roman," Margaret said, snapping her fingers in front of his face to get his attention. "You're going to want to read this. We're meeting with Tech X at noon. You've got 30 minutes. He blinked, focusing on her. Right. Tech X, of course. But even as he looked at her, his mind was still miles away, back at the gala, at the moment when Violet's eyes met his for that brief instant before she turned away. Margaret frowned. "You're a mess, Roman. Is everything okay?" He didn't answer right away. Yeah, just tired." Margaret looked at him with suspicion, but said nothing. She turned and left, but Roman's mind was already elsewhere. He reached for his phone, fingers moving automatically. A few taps, and he found himself on public records, scanning through articles, interviews, and anything that would give him more insight into Violet Stone. As the hours passed, the more Roman learned, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. She wasn't just any architect. Violet Stone was a visionary. She wasn't some socialite who used her connections to make a name for herself. She had built her reputation on her own, one project at a time, one blueprint at a time. Violet was an architect, yes, but not in the way Roman was accustomed to thinking. Where Roman built his empire on tech innovations and billion-dollar ventures, Violet's world revolved around the hard work of transforming neglected urban spaces into sustainable, eco-friendly neighborhoods. She believed in developing cities with a focus on human connection, environmental preservation, and sustainable living. She wasn't creating luxury estates or sprawling corporate headquarters. She was designing homes for people, real people, not the ones who lived in glass towers like Roman. He scrolled through more articles, each one confirming the same thing. Violet was a woman with principles. She was driven, but not by wealth. She was passionate about making a difference, something Roman hadn't truly cared about in years. He had everything, but none of it meant anything beyond the bottom line. Violet? She worked tirelessly to make the world a better place. The more he read, the more his frustration built. Roman realized that none of his usual tricks, none of his wealth, his power, his charm, would work on her. She wasn't interested in him because he was a billionaire. She didn't need him. She didn't need anything from him. She didn't need him at all. Roman leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had dealt with all kinds of women, models, actresses, socialites, who were either dazzled by his wealth or looking for the connections he could provide. But Violet was different. Her strength, her self-sufficiency, it all unnerved him. He wanted to know her, to understand her, but she remained an enigma. And for the first time in years, Roman felt a desire for something he couldn't control. That night, after another round of meaningless meetings, he found himself sitting alone in his penthouse, staring at his phone. He could still picture her face, her calm demeanor, the subtle curve of her lips when she rejected him. The image was burned into his mind, like a haunting refrain. Roman couldn't let it go. By the next day, he had hatched a plan. He would make Violet notice him. He had heard that she was passionate about sustainable urban development, and her latest project had been a hit in the media. It was a small step, but an important one. He reached out to a few mutual acquaintances, people in the architecture and real estate world who might know her, and sent an invitation. It wasn't overtly personal, not yet. Just an invitation to a business event, a gala, an industry gathering, a chance to discuss architecture and urban development. But underneath the surface, Roman's real motive was clear. He wanted to get close to Violet. He wanted her to hear him, to see him, and maybe, just maybe, acknowledge him. He didn't expect her to say yes, but he hoped for a conversation, something that would break the ice, something that would show her he wasn't just another billionaire trying to impress her. The days dragged on. Every email he sent, every connection he made, was a means to an end. The gala came, and Roman stood by the doors, waiting for Violet to arrive. His heart beat faster than usual, a sensation he had almost forgotten existed. And then, she walked in, Violet Stone. Her dark hair framed her face, and she was dressed in something simple yet elegant. Not a glittering gown or an outfit that screamed wealth. But still, she was breathtaking. She was everything Roman had imagined, and yet so much more than he had expected. But when their eyes met, she didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge him. In fact, she seemed to walk right past him, as though he were just another face in the crowd. Roman's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening with frustration. She was still rejecting him. But this time it wasn't a simple no. This was indifference. She was too busy, too focused on something else to care. He tried to follow her, to get her attention, but she was already surrounded by other professionals, discussing some project with an energy and purpose he had never seen from anyone else in the room. Roman was both captivated and infuriated. He was used to people bending over backward to get a few moments of his time. But Violet? She wasn't interested. The night passed in a blur of conversation and meaningless pleasantries. Roman couldn't focus on anything except the way Violet kept slipping through his grasp like sand in his fingers. She was there, but she wasn't. Finally, at the end of the event, Roman found himself standing near the exit, staring at the crowd. He saw her once more, standing by the doors, her back to him. She was laughing with someone, engaged in a lively discussion, completely unaware of his presence. He stepped forward, his voice low. "Violet," he said, his heart hammering in his chest. She turned, surprised, but her face quickly reverted to polite indifference. She didn't seem interested in engaging with him. She nodded and gave a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," she said, her voice soft yet firm, as if she had already decided what this conversation would be. "Roman Kingsley, right?" "That's me." Roman was trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him. He was frustrated, maybe even a little angry, but he hid it well. "It's been a while since we last spoke. I wanted to invite you to an event, discuss architecture and urban development. Perhaps we can—" "No," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not interested in mingling, Mr. Kingsley. Thank you." And there it was. That single word. No. Roman stood frozen, the word reverberating in his mind. She was still saying no. He stood there for a moment, unable to move. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't let it go. Not this time. And for the first time in his life, Roman Kingsley realized something. He wanted to win. He wanted to be the one who could make Violet Stone choose him. But the road to that was going to be more complicated than any business deal he had ever closed. Violet Stone had become his obsession. And nothing, not even her cold indifference, was going to stop him from getting closer. Roman Kingsley had always been in control. In every meeting, every transaction, every negotiation, he had mastered the art of commanding attention, of steering the course with the weight of his billions. But ever since Violet Stone had walked into his life, that certainty, that calm authority, had slipped from his grasp like water through his fingers. Every passing day, he felt the threads of control he had carefully woven unraveling. It began with the meetings. Roman sat at the head of the long glass conference table, his usual steely confidence slowly eroding. He knew the numbers, the statistics, the strategies. Yet, as his colleagues spoke, detailing projections for new tech ventures and billion-dollar acquisitions, his mind drifted, a quiet storm building in his chest. The words became white noise, a dull hum in the background. His mind wasn't on the future of his companies. It was on her. On Violet. He watched his assistant, Margaret, shuffle papers, setting up the next deal, but even her efficient movements couldn't bring his focus back. Roman's mind was far from the financial empire he had built. He couldn't stop thinking about her quiet strength, her unflinching refusal to be impressed by his wealth. There was no easy way to describe it. But for the first time in his life, Roman felt lost in a world he had once dominated. In the days that followed, his routine faltered. He found himself staying up late at night, scouring through architecture journals and urban development reports, far removed from his usual luxury real estate brochures and stock market charts. He read articles on green spaces in urban areas, the impact of architecture on communities, the future of sustainable design, things he had never cared about before. But now, the words seemed to hold weight. They felt important. Roman wasn't sure why he was doing this. He had always relied on his power and his wealth to create opportunities, to manipulate situations. But with Violet, he realized, that approach would get him nowhere. The more he read about the projects she was involved in, the more he understood the depth of her commitment. Violet didn't just build. She created environments meant to foster connection, to nurture people, not just provide shelter. She wasn't designing luxury apartments for the elite or penthouses for billionaires. She was creating spaces for human beings. He even started attending some of the same conferences she did. Architecture seminars, urban planning forums. He hated it. He hated sitting in crowded rooms full of architects, engineers, and city planners who spoke in a language Roman barely understood. He was out of his element. He didn't belong there. But he went anyway. The first time he saw Violet at one of the events, his heart stuttered in his chest. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was standing alone by a large presentation board, reviewing architectural sketches for an upcoming project. The sight of her in the midst of a room full of professionals, completely immersed in her work, filled him with a sense of awe. He watched her for a moment. Unsure of how to approach, she was everything he wasn't. Humble, grounded, and yet so fiercely independent. Roman approached cautiously, unsure of himself for the first time in a long while. "Violet," he said, his voice low but carrying through the noise of the crowd. "Roman Kingsley." She turned, a polite smile on her lips, but her eyes were guarded. The smile didn't reach them. She gave him a brief nod, acknowledging his presence without the slightest sign of recognition or interest. "What brings you here?" she asked, her tone polite but cold. "I've been learning more about urban development, architecture," he replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm intrigued by the way your projects merge sustainability with urban living." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised. "I didn't expect that from you." Roman hesitated. "I guess I'm full of surprises." Violet studied him for a moment, her gaze calculating. "You know, I don't think I've ever heard your name mentioned at any of these events. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The comment stung, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to learn, to understand." She was silent for a beat, as if weighing his sincerity. Then she offered him a curt nod. "Well, I hope you do. The world of architecture isn't one you can just buy your way into. It requires commitment." He wasn't sure if it was a challenge or just her natural inclination to remain distant. But the words cut through him. She had always seemed so untouchable, so confident in her own space. And here she was, reminding him just how much he had to prove. "I'd like to know more about your current projects," Roman ventured, trying once again to gain her interest. "Perhaps we can have a conversation sometime?" She took a moment, clearly contemplating whether or not to engage. Roman could almost see the hesitation in her eyes, the way she tried to decide if this would be worth her time. Finally, she spoke. "I have a dinner later with some colleagues," she said, her tone still polite but distant. "But I'm sure you can find someone else here to discuss your interests." And just like that, she turned away from him, her attention already moving towards someone else in the room. Roman was left standing there, feeling as if he had just been dismissed in the most polite way possible. He stayed at the event for a while longer, but it was pointless. His attention was elsewhere. It was always on her. That night, back in his penthouse, Roman sat at his desk, staring out at the glittering city below. He knew he needed to focus, to return to the things that made him powerful. The deals, the investments, the empire he had worked so hard to build. But Violet was always in the back of his mind. Her rejection, her indifference, it gnawed at him. He pulled up her latest project on his laptop, an affordable housing development project in a neglected part of the city. As he read through the plans, he couldn't help but admire the work. It was innovative, bold, and above all, it was genuine. It wasn't about money or prestige. It was about giving people a chance, about creating spaces that felt like home. Roman ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair. He had built his empire on the back of technology, on the sleek, efficient systems that kept the world spinning. But Violet's world, her work, was different. It was raw, unrefined, and filled with purpose. It was exactly the kind of world he had been craving without even knowing it. He stared at the screen for a long while, his thoughts swirling in a haze of frustration. He had everything, and yet nothing felt real anymore. And as if on cue, the thought that had been plaguing him for days appeared once again. He didn't want to buy her attention. He wanted to earn it. Roman closed the laptop with a snap, his hands trembling. This wasn't like him. He didn't need anyone's approval. He was used to being the one in control. But Violet was different. She didn't need his wealth, his connections, or his status. And that was exactly why he had to get to know her, to understand what made her tick. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that now. He needed a new approach. Roman's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form in his mind. The next day, he called a meeting with his top advisors. "I need to invest in something outside my usual realm," Roman said, his voice steady, betraying none of the confusion and frustration that had been swirling inside him. "I want to fund a new sustainable development project. Something big. Something impactful." They exchanged looks, clearly confused. Roman had always been about tech, about scaling businesses at breakneck speed. This was different, but he could see their hesitation. "I want to make an impact on the city," he continued. "I need to get involved in something real, something people can touch, something that matters." His team didn't fully understand, but they would follow his orders. They always did. Roman had made a decision. He wasn't going to buy Violet's attention anymore. He was going to prove that he could contribute something meaningful to the world she inhabited. That he wasn't just another billionaire who bought up real estate for the sake of profit. He was going to earn her respect. Weeks passed, and Roman's obsession with Violet only deepened. He visited her projects, attending planning meetings and conferences, asking questions, trying to get involved. He even started donating to environmental causes, to projects focused on sustainable housing, the very things Violet cared about. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he threw himself into her world, she remained distant. Every time they crossed paths, she remained polite, but her eyes were always guarded, like she could see straight through him. He had no idea if she was noticing his efforts, but he didn't care. He had to keep going. Roman had always been about winning, and he wasn't going to let the woman who had said no to him remain an enigma forever. The evening air was crisp as the city lights shimmered against the dark sky, casting a golden glow over the tables set up outside the intimate, unassuming bistro in Brooklyn. Roman Kingsley stood outside the small restaurant, his hands resting in his pockets as he gazed up at the neon sign, the low hum of conversation filtering through the windows. He wasn't used to this. This wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented. The places he normally visited had chandeliers that caught the light in just the right way, white tablecloths that made every meal feel like a performance, and waiters who knew exactly who he was before he had even sat down. But tonight was different. Tonight, it wasn't about the brand or the power or the reputation. Tonight, it was about Violet. Roman had known from the moment she had agreed to meet him here that this dinner would be unlike any other. No flashy displays, no corporate talk, just two people trying to make a connection. When Violet arrived, looking effortless in a simple, tailored black dress that clung to her curves just enough to hint at her elegance, Roman's heart skipped a beat. She had always been beautiful, but tonight there was a different energy about her. Something more raw, more authentic. She walked toward him with purpose, her eyes searching his face as if she, too, were feeling the weight of the moment. "Good evening," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "Good evening, Violet," Roman replied, his own voice steady. There was a nervousness in him, something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The kind of nervousness that came not from performing or impressing, but from the quiet possibility of vulnerability. As they sat at the table, their conversation began as it usually did. Small talk about the weather, the latest news in the world of architecture, and the subtle awkwardness that came from sitting across from someone whose world you had tried to infiltrate, but had only begun to understand. Violet, as always, was sharp, articulate. Her thoughts on sustainable architecture and community-focused designs flowing like water. She spoke with passion, her hands occasionally lifting as she gestured toward a window where the city sprawled in all its chaotic, beautiful imperfection. Roman listened intently, genuinely fascinated. He had spent so much of his life in a world that valued power over substance, wealth over meaning. He had never been the one to slow down, to listen with the intent of truly understanding. But with Violet, it was different. She spoke with a depth he had never encountered before, her words steeped in both the idealism of youth and the experience of someone who had fought for every inch of success. "I've always been interested in how architecture can shape the way people live," she said, a glint in her eyes as she leaned forward. "It's not just about designing buildings. It's about creating spaces that foster human connection. Spaces that help people feel like they belong, like they matter." Roman nodded, absorbing her words. "That's something I can respect," he said, his voice soft. "I've been so caught up in my world, in my business, that I've never thought about how something as simple as a building could have that kind of impact." Violet raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You've never thought about it?" He shook his head slowly. "I've built empires, made millions. But when you're constantly moving, constantly chasing the next deal, It's easy to forget that the work you do should actually have meaning. I've been so focused on expanding my influence. I never asked myself whether the things I was creating were actually helping anyone. Violet studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if she were evaluating his sincerity. "I'm not sure if I believe that, Roman," she said, her tone cautious. "It sounds like a convenient excuse, one that men like you use to justify their actions. You don't want to confront the emptiness that comes with wealth, so you pretend it doesn't matter." Roman leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. There was no anger in her voice, no disdain, just a cold, unflinching honesty. And for a moment, it stung. But then, something inside him shifted. He had spent years building walls around himself, making sure that no one could ever see how hollow it all was. But here, with Violet, it felt like he was being forced to face the truth. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than he'd ever allowed himself to be. "Maybe I've been running from the truth. I've spent my entire life chasing success, but none of it's ever been enough. I've built this empire, but when I look at it, it feels empty." Violet's expression softened slightly, though she said nothing. Roman could see that she wasn't judging him. She was just listening, which was a rarity in his world. "It's like I don't know who I am anymore," Roman continued, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've lost myself in all of this." He gestured vaguely around the restaurant, then back at her. "I've been so obsessed with being the person everyone expects me to be. The perfect businessman, the billionaire, the man who has it all, that I forgot how to just be me." Violet's gaze lingered on him for a long while, her silence speaking volumes. She had always been guarded when it came to men like Roman, men who could buy their way into any room, any heart, any situation. But there was something different about him tonight. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't putting on the usual facade. "I get it," she said, her voice gentle now. "I really do. It's easy to get lost in that world, to think that success and power will fill the void inside you. But the truth is, they won't. No matter how much money you make, how many deals you close, how many people you control, it's never going to be enough unless you're doing something that feels real, something that matters." Roman met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like they were standing on the edge of something unknown, but deeply significant. "I don't want to be like that anymore," he said, his voice low. "I don't want to just have. I want to give. I want to build something that actually makes a difference. Something that's not about money or power." Violet held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether or not he meant it. Finally, she nodded. "Good," she said softly. "Because if you really want to change, you have to be willing to give up the control. You have to be willing to trust. Trust that there's more to life than what you've built, more to who you are than the title you've been given." Roman swallowed hard. He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything around him. But in this moment, he realized that he had never truly controlled anything. Not his heart, not his desires, not even his own happiness. "I'm trying," he said, almost as if to convince himself. "I really am." Violet's expression softened, and for the first time, Roman saw a flicker of something that might have been respect in her eyes. She smiled, but it was not the cool, distant smile she had worn before. It was warmer, genuine. "You don't have to do it all at once," she said. "It's a process. Just take it one step at a time." The conversation turned to lighter topics after that, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding now, a connection that neither of them had anticipated. The walls between them had started to crack, and Roman found himself looking at Violet with a newfound admiration, a deeper respect. As they finished their meal, Roman found that he wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next project, or the next conquest. He was thinking about her, about the way she saw the world, about her passion for architecture, about her strength and her refusal to be swayed by the men who only saw her as a trophy or a stepping stone. When the check arrived, Roman reached for it, but Violet's hand stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "I've got this one." Roman raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I can't let you be the one who always pays, Roman. This time it's my turn." He smiled, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. "All right. But next time I'm picking the place." Violet's eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief. "We'll see about that." As they left the bistro, walking into the cool night air, Roman realized that something had shifted within him. He hadn't expected this conversation to be easy. He hadn't expected Violet to suddenly see him as the man he wanted to be. But tonight, he had felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the beginning of something real. Something he was willing to fight for. Roman had always believed that the past was something to be left behind. He'd built his empire on the idea that the future was where the power lay, where the real opportunities were found. Yet, as the days passed, he realized that no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from the life he'd constructed, the past had a way of clawing its way back into the present. It was Saturday afternoon when it happened. Roman had just finished a meeting with a few potential investors for a new project, a sleek, modern development in the heart of Manhattan, when he received the first message. He didn't recognize the number, but the name that followed made him freeze. Caitlin. He hadn't thought about her in years. Caitlin Marks, his ex-girlfriend, the one he'd briefly dated in his mid-20s. She was beautiful, ambitious, and always surrounded by the kind of people who made him feel like he had to prove himself. They'd shared passionate nights of wine and laughter, but there was always a hollowness beneath it all. Their relationship had been more about appearances than anything real. "Roman," the text began, "I know it's been a while, but I heard you were in town for some business. I'd love to catch up sometime." Roman let out a sigh, his fingers hovering over the screen. He knew what this was. Caitlin had never cared about him as a person. She'd always been more interested in his status, his wealth, the allure of being associated with a billionaire. She was just one of the many women he'd met along the way, fleeting figures who flattered his ego without ever truly seeing him. He debated ignoring the message, but a part of him knew that doing so would only make it worse. Caitlin wasn't the only one who would come knocking. He'd already seen the whispers in the media, the flash of cameras, the photos that painted him as the bachelor everyone wanted a piece of. It was only a matter of time before more of his past relationships resurfaced, knocking on his door with the hope that the money and power he now wielded would be enough to make them stick around. The next day, as if on cue, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a familiar name. Maya. Maya. The model who had been with him for several months before she had moved on to someone else. Maya, who had once told him that she loved him, but who left him the moment she realized the affair wasn't going to lead to anything more than an empty fling. He could feel his patience thinning with each passing message. He hadn't thought about Maya in over a year, and now here she was, reappearing in his life like a shadow he couldn't shake. No, Roman thought, a surge of irritation coursing through him. I can't go back to that. It had always been this way for Roman. Relationships had been easy, too easy. They were convenient distractions from the real work of building his empire, maintaining control, staying ahead of the game. His past lovers were a blur, faces and names fading into one indistinguishable memory. They hadn't mattered. Not like Violet. Violet. As soon as her name surfaced in his thoughts, the irritation that had bubbled up in him faded, replaced by something more profound. He remembered the way she had looked at him that night, when he had opened up about the emptiness he'd felt. She hadn't looked at him with pity or even judgment. No, Violet had listened, and something in the way she had engaged with him, as if she were truly seeing him for the first time, had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was different. She was real. But this, it wasn't real. The messages, the constant stream of women from his past trying to reconnect. It was all a part of the life he had carefully constructed, a life that now felt like a gilded cage. And Roman knew that if he didn't do something to stop it, he would be trapped in it forever. The following morning, after a restless night of contemplating his past and his future, Roman found himself staring at the text messages from Caitlin and Maya, knowing that ignoring them wouldn't make them disappear. But he also knew that continuing to entertain their reappearance would mean losing what little progress he had made with Violet. He thought of her then, the way her eyes had glimmered with curiosity, her guarded smile, the strength in her voice when she spoke about her work. Violet wasn't just another chapter in his collection of past loves. She was something different. She was someone who could make him face the parts of himself he'd long avoided, and that scared him. She could see through the layers of wealth and power he had built, and it terrified him in a way he hadn't been scared in years. That night, as he sat at his desk in his penthouse, sipping on a glass of scotch, Roman sent the messages. He typed out a brief reply to both Caitlin and Maya, keeping his tone polite but firm. I think it's best we don't reconnect. I've moved on. He stared at the screen for a moment, the words feeling both final and freeing. This was him, taking control, real control, of the narrative. His past was no longer going to dictate his future. Violet was the future. Violet was the one who had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in a long time, the desire to be more than what he was, to be more than just another billionaire who used wealth to hide his inadequacies. But as much as he wanted to focus on her, Roman knew there was still the matter of his public image to contend with. The media was relentless, and the press had already started speculating about his relationship with Violet. It wouldn't take long before someone started making assumptions. Roman had seen it happen before with other women, women who had entered his life for a fleeting moment only to be swept away when the next headline-grabbing affair came along. He couldn't let that happen to Violet. Violet was at her office the next morning, the stress of balancing her career with her personal life wearing on her as the day wore on. She had just wrapped up a meeting with a potential client when she received an unexpected message. It was from Roman. Violet, I understand if you're uncomfortable with my past relationships resurfacing, but I need to be honest with you. I'm not the man I used to be. I'm working to change that, and I'd like to prove it to you. Violet stared at the message for a long time, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had known this was coming. Roman's past, the media buzz, the constant reminder that he was always going to be the billionaire in the room. These were things she had expected. But now, for the first time, she saw a side of him she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. It was a confession, but it was also a challenge. Roman was trying to break free from the shackles of his old life. But Violet wasn't sure if that was even possible. The wealthy world he inhabited, the superficial relationships he'd built, couldn't just be erased overnight. But something in his words resonated with her. She had seen glimpses of something more genuine in him, even in the brief moments they had spent together. And despite her skepticism, despite the fear that he was only seeking another conquest, Violet couldn't help but wonder if there was a chance, however small, that Roman might be sincere. Roman had never been good at waiting. His entire life had been about getting what he wanted, and getting it now. But with Violet, it was different. He knew he couldn't rush her. He couldn't buy her affection or force her to trust him. For the first time in years, Roman had to earn something. And it was something that meant more to him than all the wealth and power he had accumulated over the years. He had to prove that he wasn't the same man who had relied on his status to get everything he wanted. He had to show Violet that he was capable of giving her something real. Not just money, not just status. Respect. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure how to do that. The message he sent was the first step, but it was just a step. Violet sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of Roman's words settle on her chest. She had seen the headlines, heard the rumors, and felt the distance between them grow with every passing day. But this message, his confession, was different. She wasn't sure if it was enough to change her mind. But it was a start, and for the first time in their interactions, Violet felt like there might be a chance for something genuine to bloom between them. But there was still the matter of trust. Roman's past, his wealth, his reputation, it was all a part of who he was. But if he wanted her, if he truly wanted to prove himself, he would have to show her that he was willing to take a different path, one that didn't involve the games he had played with others. And that, she realized, was the biggest challenge of all. For the first time in their strange, complicated dance, they were both at a crossroads, and neither knew exactly which direction they were heading. Roman sat at his desk, the soft glow of the late afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows of his penthouse. His gaze drifted out over the skyline of New York, the city he had conquered in every way possible, yet it felt so distant now. Everything that had once excited him, the sprawling business ventures, the endless nights spent in lavish restaurants, the women who had gravitated towards him, had begun to feel so insignificant. For weeks, he had been walking a different path. He was no longer the man who relied on his wealth and power to manipulate and control. He had been showing up to charity events where he wasn't the center of attention, quietly volunteering with local organizations, and even visiting the homeless shelters in the Lower East Side to help with food distribution. It wasn't something he did for publicity or recognition. It was for himself. For once, he wanted to feel like he was doing something that mattered, something beyond the transactions of board meetings and high-profile deals. But despite all his efforts, despite the changes he was trying to make, there was still one thing that eluded him: the trust of Violet Stone. Violet had become his constant thought, the one thing that could pull him from his cynical world and make him question everything he had built. And yet, he still hadn't earned her trust. She was still guarded, still questioning whether his intentions were genuine or if he was simply playing a part, putting on a mask for her approval. The email notification popped up on his screen. He clicked it open and saw a message from her. "Roman, I see the changes you've been making, and I admire your efforts. But I need more than words and good deeds. I need to know who you are, not who you want me to see. The person I've met so far is someone I've never believed could change. But you've shown me something different. Keep showing me and maybe I'll be convinced." Her words hit him like a punch in the stomach. They were both an invitation and a challenge, a subtle test he knew he had to pass if he ever hoped to earn her respect. But he didn't mind the test. In fact, it was exactly what he needed. Violet's doubts were the spark that kept him moving forward. If he wanted her to truly see him, not the billionaire, not the facade, he had to prove he was more than just the man she thought he was. Violet had been watching Roman closely, both intrigued and cautious. She had seen the changes he was making, but she still wasn't convinced. She couldn't allow herself to believe that someone like Roman Kingsley, the billionaire who could buy anything, the man who was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, could truly change. She had witnessed too many men, powerful men, who had made promises they never kept. Roman's wealth, his past, his ability to control situations with his money, they were not easily erased. It was easy to be skeptical of him. And maybe, just maybe, her hesitation was rooted in something deeper, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to admit. The possibility that she might want to believe in him. She wasn't sure she could risk it. She had been burned before, and the fear of getting caught in a lie, of falling for a man who wasn't who he seemed, still lingered in her chest like a tight knot. But Roman's efforts were undeniable. She couldn't deny that his actions were different, that there was something more there than the usual show of wealth and prestige. It wasn't enough yet, but she was starting to see glimpses of something real. The ultimate test came sooner than Roman had expected. It was a Friday evening, and he was attending a private gala for a new architectural development project. The guest list was a who's who of New York's elite, including high-profile business magnates, famous architects, and top investors from around the world. Roman was used to these events. He had attended hundreds like them in the past. But tonight, the stakes were different. Tonight, he wasn't here to network, to close deals, or to remind people of his influence. Tonight, he was here for something more. Violet would be attending, and it was clear to Roman that this would be his biggest test yet. He knew that she was watching, waiting for him to slip back into his old habits, the same habits that had alienated everyone he'd ever cared about. But tonight, he wasn't going to play by those rules. He would show her who he really was, without any of the masks or the games. As he entered the gala, he noticed her immediately. She was standing near the stage, speaking to a small group of architects. Her presence was undeniable, as always. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress that made her look like she belonged to the room, but also set her apart from everyone else. Her confidence radiated from her, and Roman couldn't help but admire the way she held herself. She wasn't there for the fame or the glitz. She was there for the cause, for the work she had dedicated her life to. It was humbling, and it made him want to rise to meet her level of integrity. As the evening wore on, Roman kept his distance, allowing the evening to unfold naturally. He wasn't sure when the shift occurred. Maybe it was when Violet made her way to the stage to present the award for the night's architectural achievements. But at some point, the pressure of the event and the weight of the moment settled into Roman's chest. This was it. This was the moment where he would have to make a choice. Between the old life and the new one, he was fighting so hard to create. Violet was preparing to leave the stage when Roman made his way toward her. He stood at the edge of the room, hesitating for a moment before he took a step forward. "Violet!" he called out, his voice barely audible above the buzz of the room. She turned to face him, a faint smile on her lips. But there was wariness in her eyes, an unspoken challenge. She was waiting to see if he would slip, if he would revert to his old ways. "I'd like to have a word with you," he said, his voice steady. There was no arrogance in it, no expectation. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just trying to be real. Violet looked at him for a long moment before nodding, signaling for him to follow her to a quieter area of the venue. They moved through the crowd, the noise of the gala fading as they stepped into a secluded alcove near the back of the room. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Roman didn't know where to begin, but his instincts guided him. "I'm not here to make a deal," he began. "I'm not here to talk business. I want you to know that I'm serious about this, about the changes I'm making." Violet raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I've heard that before, Roman," she said quietly. "I've seen it before. Men like you make promises, change their behavior for a while, and then slip right back into their old ways." Roman's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I get it," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I'm not asking you to trust me just because I say I've changed. But I want to prove it to you. I want you to see that I'm not the same person who—" He stopped himself. "I'm not the same man who walked into your life and tried to impress you with money. I want to show you that there's more to me than that. And if that takes time, then I'll wait. But I won't stop." Violet looked at him for a moment, and for the first time, Roman saw something flicker in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. She took a step closer to him, her expression unreadable. "You say you've changed," she said slowly. "But the question is, can you actually walk away from your old life? From everything you've built? From the people who want something from you?" Roman didn't hesitate. Yes, I can. I'm not asking you to believe it overnight, but I'm asking for the chance to prove it, to show you that I'm willing to walk away from the things that matter to me the least." Violet studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. "And if I don't believe you?" she asked, her voice steady, but with an edge of doubt. Roman took a deep breath. This was it. He wasn't going to back down. "Then I'll keep proving it to you, day by day, because I want something real. And you, Violet, are the only person who's ever made me feel like I could actually have that." For a long moment, Violet said nothing. Then, she looked away. Her gaze fixed on the floor as she processed his words. Roman could feel the tension between them, the unspoken barrier that still existed. But he knew that this was the turning point. He had taken his shot. "Okay," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "I'll give you one chance, but I'm not going to make this easy for you. You'll have to prove it, every step of the way." Roman nodded, a quiet sense of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had taken the first step towards something real, something that went beyond the walls of his empire. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. Roman sat at his desk, the evening light dimming in the penthouse as he stared at the blank page before him. The weight of the words felt almost too heavy to lift. He had written countless emails, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and signed contracts with the stroke of a pen. But this felt different. This wasn't a business transaction or a well-crafted public statement. It was personal. It was about the one thing he had never been able to control, his own vulnerability. He had spent the last several weeks reflecting on his life, his choices, and what he truly wanted. There had been no easy answers. The world he had built, the empire of wealth, power, and influence, seemed like a distant memory now, something he had long ago outgrown. And in the process of shedding that old skin, he had learned something profound, that no amount of money, no amount of success could ever fill the emptiness he had felt for so long. The idea of a real connection, the kind of connection he had always dismissed as a weakness, had become a compelling thought. Violet had made him realize just how shallow his relationships had been, how transactional everything in his life had become. She had made him question whether it was possible to have something more than the fleeting satisfaction of acquiring what he wanted. But now, as he stared at the blank page, Roman realized something else. It wasn't just about what he wanted. It was about proving to Violet that he could be something more than just a billionaire who bought his way into everything. He wanted her to see him, not as a man who used wealth as a crutch, but as someone who could stand on his own 2 feet, someone who could fight for something real. He began to write. Dear Violet, I don't expect this letter to change anything between us, and I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to say the things I've been too afraid to admit, things I've hidden from myself for too long. I've spent my life using my wealth as a shield, a crutch to get what I want, to avoid the hard work of truly connecting with people. I've always believed that if I had enough money, enough influence, I could control my world. But in trying to control everything around me, I lost sight of the one thing that really matters: people. You were right to question me. My past is a series of empty gestures, hollow relationships, and the pursuit of fleeting satisfaction. I built my life on acquiring things, businesses, properties, people, and I never once stopped to ask myself if it was worth it. I never stopped to wonder if I was missing something that couldn't be bought. Since meeting you, I've had to confront the truth I've been running from. I've realized that my wealth doesn't define me. It never has. I don't want to be the man who can buy your attention, who can impress you with my bank account or my reputation. I want to be the man who earns your respect through actions, not transactions. I want to fight for something real, something that's not dictated by the wealth I've accumulated or the power I hold. I know I have a long way to go. I'm not asking you to believe in me just because I say the words. But I need you to know this. I am trying. I am working every day to become the kind of man who deserves the chance to be with someone like you. I hope that in time, I can show you that I'm more than the man you first saw. A billionaire who thought he could buy everything he wanted. You've challenged me in ways I never thought possible, and for that, I will be forever grateful. Whatever happens next, I just want you to know that I am willing to fight for this. For us. Roman Kingsley. Roman sat back in his chair, the weight of the letter settling in his chest. He had said everything he needed to say, but the silence that followed felt like an eternity. He knew this wasn't the end. Violet had made it clear that words weren't enough. He would need to prove himself with his actions, something he had never truly done before. The next day, Violet's response arrived in his inbox. He had been expecting something, but when he saw her name in the subject line, his heart skipped a beat. She hadn't said anything for weeks, not directly at least. But now she had given him this, a small opening, a thread of hope. Roman, I can't say that I wasn't touched by your letter. It's not easy for someone like you to admit what you did, and I respect that. But I'm not going to make this easy for you. I can't. Not because I don't believe you, but because I've seen this play before. Words are easy, Roman. Actions are what count. I'm willing to give you a chance, but I need time. I need to see if this is real or if you're just going through the motions because it feels like the right thing to do. You've already made your intentions clear, and for the first time in a long time, I believe you. But I can't rush into this. I've learned the hard way that the truth isn't always what it seems. Take your time, Roman. I'll be watching. Violet Roman stared at the screen, the weight of her words sinking in. She hadn't given him a definitive answer, but that was exactly what he had expected. It wasn't about winning her over with a single gesture or a well-timed confession. It was about proving himself, day after day. He was ready for that. For the next several weeks, Roman threw himself into the work of changing. He immersed himself in the world of architecture and urban planning, learning about the issues that mattered to Violet. He spent hours reading architecture journals, attending conferences, and visiting the projects she had designed. He wanted to understand her world, not just as a means to impress her, but because he genuinely cared. Each time he visited one of Violet's projects, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. These buildings were more than just structures to house people. They were reflections of her values: sustainability, community, and innovation. He admired how she had built a reputation on these principles, never compromising on her vision. She didn't need the accolades or the attention. She had created something that was meaningful, something that would last long after the fame faded. Roman began to feel that same desire, to create something that mattered, something he could be proud of. He had always been in control, always had the upper hand, but now he was learning what it meant to be vulnerable, to put himself out there without the armor of his wealth. One evening, weeks after he had sent the letter, Roman found himself at a small art exhibit in Soho. He had never been one for art shows, but Violet had mentioned in passing that she would be attending. It wasn't just about showing up anymore. He wanted to be part of her world, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged there. As he entered the gallery, he immediately saw her. She was standing by a large abstract painting, her eyes scanning the colors and shapes with an intensity that only Violet could convey. Roman felt a rush of admiration, followed by a wave of uncertainty. Would she acknowledge him? Would she dismiss him again? He took a deep breath and approached her, carefully this time. No grand gestures, no attempt to impress her with his usual charm. He simply wanted to talk to her. "Violet," he said softly, his voice carrying through the noise of the crowd. She turned to face him, her expression neutral, but not unwelcoming. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps curiosity, but nothing more. "Roman," she said, her voice steady, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to see what you're so passionate about," he replied, his tone sincere, "to learn more about what drives you." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "You've been making an effort," she said finally, "and I can see that. But words are still just words. It's the actions that matter." Roman nodded. "I know. And I'll keep proving it, Violet. I don't expect anything from you. I just want to be better. For myself and, if you'll allow me, for you too." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to the painting, her eyes lingering on the swirling patterns of color. Roman stood beside her, not speaking, just waiting. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I'm still waiting, Roman. Waiting to see if this is real. If you really mean it." Roman's heart swelled with both hope and resolve. "I'll show you," he said quietly. "Every single day." For the first time, Violet smiled. It wasn't a smile of approval, but it was a smile nonetheless. Small, tentative, but full of promise. And for Roman, that was enough. The city hummed with a constant pulse, a cacophony of noise, of power, of ambition. Roman had always thrived in the hustle of it all, finding comfort in the swirl of business meetings, luxury dinners, and media attention. But now, amidst the skyscrapers of Manhattan, there was a tension inside him, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't go away. Every interaction, every conversation, felt like it had been tainted by his past. And the more time he spent with Violet, the more he realized how much of himself he still had to let go of, how much of his old life he had to abandon. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind. He had thrown himself into work, his tech company, his various investments, but nothing could drown out the feeling that his world was shifting. Violet had already begun to change him in ways that were too deep to ignore. But there was a price to be paid for this transformation, a price that Roman wasn't entirely prepared for. He sat at his desk in his penthouse office, the soft evening light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread before him like an ocean of lights, yet he felt strangely disconnected from it all. His phone buzzed, again. He didn't need to look at it to know who it was. His mother. The relationship between Roman and his mother, Claire Kingsley, was built on expectations, not affection. She was a force of nature, a socialite with more power than most could fathom, and a woman who knew how to bend others to her will. She had spent Roman's entire life teaching him that the only thing that mattered was the image they projected. And for years, he had followed her lead, building an empire with her as his silent partner. But now, with Violet in his life, everything had changed. And it was a change that Claire refused to accept. He picked up his phone, staring at the text message. Claire Kingsley. Roman, we need to talk. This obsession with Violet Stone is beneath you. She's not the right woman for you. You need someone who understands the responsibilities that come with your name. Someone who can carry herself in our world. Roman set the phone down with a sigh, rubbing his temples. He had heard it all before. Claire had never been subtle about her disdain for anyone who didn't fit her vision of what the Kingsley family should be. She had always chosen his partners, his friends, his associates based on their status, their ability to enhance the family's legacy. And Violet, with her modest upbringing, her dedication to sustainable architecture, and her refusal to be bought, was a direct threat to everything his mother stood for. But it wasn't just Claire. The pressure was coming from everywhere. His business partners had started whispering about his distractions. The tabloids had latched onto the budding relationship, and the media was now calling him the billionaire who'd fallen for a working woman. The headline had stung more than he cared to admit. They saw him as weak, as a man who was no longer focused on accumulating wealth, but on pursuing something intangible, something real. He knew what was at stake. The boardroom, the media, the social circles. Everything he had worked so hard to build was now at risk. His reputation, his power, his legacy, everything his mother had ingrained in him was on the line. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that none of it mattered. Not anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see his assistant, Margaret, standing in the doorway, holding a stack of papers. "Your mother called," she said flatly. "She wants you to come to dinner tonight. She says it's urgent." Roman's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'll be there." Margaret hesitated. "She won't be happy with that answer." "I don't care." Margaret nodded. She knew better than anyone that Roman had never been good at bending to anyone's will, not even his mother's. But tonight, he felt something stronger than defiance. He felt the weight of a decision that had been building for weeks. He had been playing by the rules for too long, living a life that was designed for him, not by him. Violet had shown him a different way of living, one that was authentic, raw, and vulnerable. And though it terrified him to admit it, he was beginning to understand that he didn't need to follow the same path his family had carved out for him. He didn't need to be the man they wanted him to be. He could choose something else. Roman looked down at the stack of papers in front of him, the contracts, the deals, the numbers that had once filled him with excitement. Now they felt empty, like the hollow shell of the life he had built. He pushed them aside, standing up from his desk with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. It was time to take control. Violet sat in her office late into the evening, the quiet hum of the city just beyond her windows. The gallery event she had attended earlier that night was still fresh in her mind. She had spent the evening being hailed as a rising star in the architecture world, her projects celebrated for their beauty and sustainability. But despite the accolades, the applause, there was still an emptiness inside her. She had spent years building her career, putting all her energy into creating spaces that mattered. But now, with Roman in her life, she was questioning everything. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Roman. Roman Kingsley. "Violet, I need to see you. There's something I need to say." She stared at the message for a moment, unsure of how to respond. After everything they had been through, after everything he had shown her, she still wasn't sure if she could trust him. She had spent so long protecting herself from men like him, the ones who saw her as a prize to be won, a trophy to be collected. Roman had been different, but she couldn't shake the fear that he would eventually revert to the man he had always been. Someone who used his wealth to manipulate those around him. But something in his message felt different. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a plea. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was curious. She typed a quick response. "Where?" Later that evening, Roman arrived at the restaurant, a small, intimate Italian place in the Lower East Side that Violet had mentioned during one of their earlier conversations. She had insisted on it, saying it was one of the few places where the food was authentic and not for show. Roman had agreed without hesitation. It wasn't about impressing her anymore. It was about understanding her world, even the small, quiet corners of it. He was seated at a table when Violet arrived, looking as stunning as ever in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She sat down across from him, her gaze steady but guarded. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't know where else to go." Violet didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, her dark eyes searching for something he wasn't sure he could provide. She had been through too much, seen too much, to let her guard down easily. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want, Roman?" He exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want to be honest with you. About everything." She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Honesty isn't easy for people like you. You've spent your whole life hiding behind wealth and power." Roman flinched at the sharpness in her tone, but he didn't back down. "I know. But I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to be the man you think I am. I don't want to be defined by what I have, but by who I am." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, this time with more warmth in her voice. "I've seen you try, Roman. I've seen you make an effort. But I need to know that this isn't just a phase. I need to know that you're not just trying to win me over with the same tricks you've used your whole life." Roman nodded, his hands tightening around the glass of water in front of him. I know. I understand. But I'm not asking you to believe me right away. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove it. For the first time that night, Violet's guard seemed to lower. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. This is hard for me, Roman. I've worked so hard to get where I am, to make something of myself. I've built my reputation, my career, without relying on anyone's wealth or connections. I can't be just another chapter in your story. Roman leaned forward, his voice steady and sincere. You won't be. I won't let you be. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. It was a delicate moment, fragile and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Roman felt something shift inside him. He wasn't trying to buy her attention anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply trying to be real. And that, in itself, felt like the greatest victory he could ever hope for. As the evening wore on, they spoke about their lives, their passions, and the challenges they had faced. There was no grand gesture, no declaration of love. But for the first time, they were connecting on a level that felt genuine. No wealth, no power, just two people trying to understand each other. Violet didn't give him an answer that night, but she didn't walk away either. That, for Roman, was enough. The next morning, he woke with a new sense of purpose. The price of change had been steep, but he was willing to pay it. For the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something real, something that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that something was Violet. The city of Manhattan sprawled beneath Roman like a battlefield, its streets pulsing with the energy of the wealthy and powerful, those who lived for the daily rush of success, the endless pursuit of more. For most of his life, Roman Kingsley had been one of them, a titan of industry, a billionaire whose name commanded respect, whose empire sprawled across continents. Yet, as he stood at the edge of the penthouse, looking out over the vast city, the emptiness inside him seemed more oppressive than ever before. Violet Stone had changed everything. She had torn through his walls, shattered the carefully constructed version of himself that he had spent years perfecting. For the first time, Roman wasn't seeking to conquer her. He wasn't chasing her for the validation his wealth had always afforded him. He had spent his life trying to own everything, to possess it all, and he had been successful. But none of it had filled the void inside him. Not until Violet had said no. No. It was the first rejection Roman had ever experienced that had felt like a gift. It forced him to look deeper into himself, to question everything he had built, and to finally face the reality that his wealth was a crutch. He had used it as a shield, a way to manipulate and control, to buy everything he thought he needed. But Violet had seen through it. She had seen him, and for the first time, he had felt seen. Now, as the city lay beneath him, he could no longer hide behind the security of his wealth. It was time to make a choice. The decision had been made, and it was a decision that would shape the rest of his life. Roman had called a press conference for that afternoon, the kind of event he had once orchestrated with a carefully crafted agenda. New product launches, business expansions, or political donations. But this time, there would be no grand announcements, no deals to be made. This time he was stepping into the public eye to make a statement that would be as raw and vulnerable as he had ever been. As he stood at the podium, the room full of reporters, cameras flashing, he could feel his heart racing. It wasn't the usual excitement of being in the spotlight. It was the fear of being exposed, of opening himself up to a world that had only ever known him as the powerful billionaire who could buy anything, including attention. Now, the world would see him as he truly was, a man who was willing to give up everything he had for something real. The room fell silent as Roman cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the sea of familiar faces. His mother's was not among them, and for the first time, he was relieved. The press, the analysts, the influencers, they all expected him to announce a new business venture, a partnership that would add more zeros to his bank account. But instead, he was about to do something that would make all of them question everything they knew about him. He took a deep breath and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today," he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I'm here to make a public statement, one that will, no doubt, surprise many of you. I've spent my entire life building an empire. I've acquired wealth, power, influence, and for a long time I believed that those things defined who I was." He paused, allowing his words to settle in. The room was silent, hanging on to his every syllable. "But I've come to realize that I've been wrong," he continued, his eyes flickering with sincerity. "I've allowed my wealth to define me for far too long. I've used it to control, to manipulate, to get what I want. And I thought that was enough. But it isn't. It never was." He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, but this time, it didn't matter. He wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for himself, for the life he was choosing to live now, not the one he had been conditioned to live. "I've been hiding behind my wealth, behind my empire, but I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be a man of integrity, of substance. And I want to prove to one woman, Violet Stone, that I am more than just a billionaire. I want to prove that I am worthy of her respect, her trust, and maybe, just maybe, her love." The words felt like a weight lifted off his shoulders, and as he glanced up at the reporters, he saw confusion, surprise, and even skepticism in their eyes. But that didn't matter anymore. For the first time, Roman wasn't speaking for their approval. He was speaking for himself. "I'm not here to announce a new business venture," he said, his tone resolute. "I'm not here to ask for your admiration or approval. I'm here to tell you that I've made a choice. I'm choosing to be a better man, and I'm choosing to fight for something real. I am renouncing my wealth as a measure of my worth. From now on, the only thing that will define me is the integrity with which I live my life." Roman's heart pounded in his chest as he concluded, his voice unwavering. "I'm done being defined by my bank account. I'm done being the man you think I should be. From now on, I'll be the man I want to be. The man who is worthy of Violet Stone." He stepped back from the podium, his eyes meeting the crowd for a moment before he turned and walked off the stage. The silence in the room was deafening, but it didn't matter. Roman knew that he had just taken the most important step of his life. Violet stood on the balcony of her apartment, her phone in her hand, the words of Roman's public announcement echoing in her mind. She had watched the press conference, just as she had watched him over the past few weeks, trying to figure out if this was real. Could Roman really change? Could he really leave behind everything he had been taught to believe? Or was this just another elaborate performance to win her over? As she stared out at the city below, she felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Roman could truly change, that he was willing to give up everything for the chance at something real. But she had been burned before. She had seen men like him, the ones with power, money, and status, come and go, always seeking something to fill the emptiness inside them. only to turn back to their old lives when the novelty wore off. She didn't want to be just another notch on Roman's belt, another conquest to be acquired. But she also couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice, the way he had spoken of his desire to be better, to be someone worthy of her. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Roman Kingsley. "Violet, I know that words are easy, but I want to show you with my actions that I'm serious. Please give me a chance to prove it to you." Violet bit her lip, her heart torn between doubt and hope. She had spent so much of her life fighting to stand on her own, to be seen for who she was, not for who she could be next to someone else. She had built her career on her own terms, and she wasn't about to let a man, no matter how sincere he seemed, take that away from her. But Roman had given her something she hadn't expected: vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to change. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth considering. With a sigh, she typed a response. "Violet Stone. I don't know if I can trust this yet, Roman, but I'm willing to see if you're really who you say you are." She pressed send and stared at the screen for a moment before putting the phone down. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time, she felt like there was a possibility, something real, something honest, that she hadn't seen before. The next few days were a whirlwind. Roman had followed through on his promises, meeting her at events, attending her lectures on sustainable architecture, and volunteering at local projects with her. He was determined to prove that he wasn't just a man of wealth, but a man who wanted to contribute to something greater than himself. Violet couldn't deny the change in him, but she remained cautious. She didn't want to be swept away by his charm, by his transformation. She needed time to see if this was the man he truly was, or if he would slip back into his old ways. But as she watched him work alongside her, as he listened intently to her ideas, and as he shared his own hopes and fears with her, she found herself starting to believe. And for the first time in a long while, Violet allowed herself to wonder, could this be real? Could they really build something together, not defined by wealth or status, but by respect and love? Roman sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He had just received Violet's message. He had hoped for more, maybe a confirmation that she was ready to take the next step with him. But her response was guarded, unsure. She was still testing him, still unsure of his sincerity. But that was fine. He was willing to wait. He had spent his life chasing after things, acquiring them and discarding them when they no longer held his interest. But this, Violet, was different. He wasn't going to let her slip away, not this time. He stood up, a new resolve settling in his chest. Roman had made his choice, and now, all he had to do was prove that he was worthy of it. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time, Roman felt like he was on the right path, one that didn't lead to empty power, empty wealth, and empty relationships. Instead, it led to something real, something honest, something worth fighting for. And that something was Violet. For the first time in his life, Roman was ready to fight for love. And this time, he wasn't going to lose.